Reporters for Vice News travel the world, putting a human face to the world's most important stories.
There's a solid wall of riot police officers.
But now, we introduce you to them.
They're doing CPR on one of the casualties here. We don't know if he's going to make it.
This is Field Notes, a show that sits down with our reporters to find out the stories behind their stories and how they got so close to the action.
Feel pretty good about that?
In this episode, a Guatemalan man was deported and died trying to get back to his family. We talked to the team that journeyed through smuggling routes over the border and through the legal maze to investigate his death.
Go!
We're in Comitancillo. At least 3,000 people, probably more, have arrived here. They're basically here to pay tribute to 13 migrants from the town. These migrants left here 2 months ago to the day in search of the American dream, and right now they're returning, but in caskets.
Era necesario que estos jóvenes y señoritas llegaran a su natal pueblo, Santa Cruz, Comitancillo.
Es muy difícil para aceptarlo, lo que pasó por él. Y no puedo creerlo también, porque estábamos acostumbrados, pues siempre estábamos juntos. Cuando venía en la casa, no hay nadie. ¿Por qué pasó eso? No tenía que pasar así.
Emily, Jika, David, thank you guys for joining me. There's so much to talk about in this documentary because there's so much you guys are covering, from the tragedy of the killing to the raid, the big ICE raid in the United States, to the larger conversations about immigration, the enforcement behind it, the factors in countries like Guatemala that are making people want to come to the United States in the first place, and the personal story of the people that you've followed. And I kind of want to start with the first scene in the story because it is so poignant. I'm wondering, Emily, if you can start by just talking about that first scene, what it was like to be there, and how we talk about the phenomenon of immigration otherwise, but how personal, how central it is to humanity it is, and what being there was like for you.
Right. I think that we often talk about migrants as this monolith, as in 100,000 migrants reached the US border in July, without realizing or emphasizing that they are from specific towns with rich customs and traditions. And that was really the case for Comitancillo, Guatemala, where Edgar Lopez is from, or where he spent the early years of his life. It was an incredibly moving moment. I mean, there were thousands of people out grieving their family members and friends who had been murdered in this massacre. And it was quite emotive. And I think one of the scenes that most stood out to me is folks had their telephones and they had put the flashlight on. And so you could just see all around these lights. And it felt like the biggest, most emotive funeral I'd ever gone to in some ways. And I was just taking it in, and it was incredibly sad and incredibly moving at the same time.
Chica, what about you?
I had never seen anything like it. We also really didn't know what to expect. When we arrived there, that same morning, the bodies had arrived to Guatemala, and so we had been filming since I think we got to the airport where the bodies arrived to around 6 a.m. And we were just kind of following this procession from Guatemala City out and through the highway and through the mountains to Comitancillo, and it was just really, really powerful and to be honest, completely unexpected as a scene and as a way of remembering and grieving for your loved ones.
And David, same question.
what was completely unexpected is how public grieving was in Comitancillo. It was collective. It was a process that the entire town, as Emily said, thousands of people showed up, and all of them were sort of like in this collective, massive grieving. Um, and I guess that speaks a lot to the traditions of Man people in this part of Guatemala. But at the same time, it was kind of like there were government officials with the bodies. They were kind of like escorting the bodies. So at the same time, there was this other presence by the government. And I think that didn't feel quite okay. The families and the community wanted to have the bodies like for their own grieving process, but the government was trying to sort of like take control of the whole thing. And that's why we also in the documentary say at some point, these migrants were received like heroes when they came back in caskets to Guatemala. But the government didn't care about them when they were departing 2 months before, when they were going for the U.S. So I got those two feelings, right? Like the communal part of it, and then the government trying to control the narrative of the moment.
And Emily, talk to me about the journalism a bit, because you're retracing the story and the journey of one individual, a collection of individuals as well. There is a massacre, which itself was somewhat secretive. How did you go about tracing the journey itself? How did you go about trying to find out what happened, both at the raid here in the United States and then also at the site of the massacre itself?
When the massacre happened, David and I started texting immediately saying this is a big deal. And, all credit to David that he found the story of Edgar Lopez. And Edgar had lived in the United States half of his life, had been deported in these 2019 poultry plant raids. And David said, hey, this happened. And I immediately said, that's an amazing story. I mean, I think we both knew it the minute that he made that realization. And we, pretty much a few days after the massacre, we went to the Comitancillo, Guatemala to try and talk with the family members of the victims. And there was a calculation in that because we thought, these family members are going to, at some point, get tired of the media. And they're going to get tired of people saying, tell me about your grief. I mean, there's always in journalism a slight vulture aspect to it, which I think we try to mitigate, but you do the best that you can. And so we wanted to get to Guatemala as soon as possible to talk to the family members before they felt overwhelmed and before perhaps they shut out the media. And so we did that. We met up with Edgar's family in Guatemala. And the process from there was to try and meet with Edgar's family in Mississippi. And again, these are very difficult calculations because you're trying to expose an injustice, and yet you are asking people to share the darkest moments of their lives as they are living them. So we go to Mississippi after Guatemala, and with the help of the priest and sort of the church in Mississippi, we gain access to the family of Lopez. And we talk to them and we try and cultivate some relationship and hear their story and sort of say, we are going to do justice to your story instead of justice to the story of your husband, of your father, instead of putting out maybe a really quick piece, just doing the bare outlines. And I want to just emphasize how much of a team effort this entire process was. I mean, I think that throughout the reporting process, each of us took leads in different ways. So David, for example, took a real lead with the family of Edgar Lopez. I took more of a lead in terms of finding the details of the massacre. And that is why the story is so comprehensive, because you have each of us taking leads in our respective ways and being able to piece the stories together. And at every stage, Jika is there saying we need visuals. We need to make sure we tell this story in a visual way, which, because I am a print reporter by training, that is not something that comes naturally to me.
Jika, talk to me about visuals. Specifically, I want to talk about the court recordings that you guys had of Edgar's hearings in criminal court, I believe, at which judges they said some things about the injustice of having to rule a certain way because of the way that laws are written at the moment. And then what was really surprising to me is that even though a certain sentence was handed down by a judge, ICE then was able to take the case whatever direction kind of they wanted to. So it's one of the most visually arresting parts of the piece for me was when you guys used animation to fill in some of the parts that were just audio transcripts. And I wonder if you could talk to me about putting that together, what your thinking was as far as how that would be effective, and just the basics of like, you listen to these transcripts and it's just like, wow.
Well, I actually, that's the one visual part I can't really take credit for at all because our graphics team is incredible. And we were lucky enough that we were given the resources and the time to work with them. And really that goes back to the reporting, and that really goes back to David and Emily both just continuing to dig, not just in Guatemala and Mexico, but also in Mississippi. And I mean, to me, one of the most powerful things is that they actually, they found these recordings and we actually hear this man's voice who, it's just a little bit, it's not super clear audio because the audio of the hearings, is crap, but it's so powerful to just hear a little bit from him, and you kind of get a sense of who he was and how he thought about things directly from him through those court hearings and recordings.
We are before the court on an anticipated change of plea.
Primeramente, no tengo derecho en este país, pero ante Dios sí tengo derecho porque en este país he trabajado mucho para Dios. Tengo 3 hijos aquí en Estados Unidos, tengo 3 nietos, toda la familia está aquí. Ahí está mi hija que se va a casar el 4 de diciembre. Gracias a esta gran nación. Gracias. Me encontraron trabajando, nada más trabajando simplemente en este país para salir adelante.
So, Emily, talk to me about that raid. What was it? I remember hearing about it a bit in the headlines, but this was a deep dive into it that I hadn't before seen.
So the August 2019 raid of the chicken plants came on the heels of nearly weekly threats by President Trump of massive raids in the United States. There had been one planned in Oakland. The mayor of Oakland blew the whistle on that raid. And then we get this one across several chicken plants in central Mississippi. Nearly 700 people were arrested, and strikingly, the raid took place on the first day of school. And so the raid generated huge media attention across the United States. You saw these really gripping, horrible images of children crying because their parents had been arrested. And ultimately, Edgar is picked up in that arrest. Around half of the nearly 700 people who are detained are released, but not Edgar. And one of the striking findings in our reportings is what was the aftermath? So the U.S. attorney, when the raids happened, he was very clear, we are not just going after undocumented immigrants, we are going after the employers, the companies that hire undocumented immigrants. Now, as you can imagine, that is not how things played out. Not a single one of the chicken plants targeted in the raids was charged. They weren't even fined. Just two mid-level managers and human resources employees were indicted. And meanwhile, 230 people picked up in the raids were eventually deported, including Edgar. And I think this speaks to what exactly are we trying to get at with workplace raids. And if this is any example, the people who suffer the most are the undocumented immigrants. I mean, the poultry plants still fill their ranks with undocumented workers, and the work is grueling. And I just want to paint a picture for you. Many of the workers hang chicken plants on a conveyor belt, and these conveyor belts go incredibly fast, and they're just hanging the chicken, one after another before they're slaughtered. And for that work, they make between $14 and $17 an hour. And what we heard from the workers in Carthage, Mississippi, is that those who work at night make a little bit more money because there's less oversight and less regulations.
And I think that speaks to just like, we're talking about chicken, we're talking about food, we're talking about necessary supply chains for everyone in the United States to live the lives that we live. And yet, there's no accounting for the labor at times that it takes for that to happen, for us to be able to have chicken at the prices that we get it and the abundance that we get it. So this is a story that, in a lot of ways indicts us, all of us, regardless of our immigration status, into the grind of people that come through it and are expelled, then maybe want to come back because they have family here. These are families. We would call these American families, no matter what, right? Or the Americas is actually a very large place, not just the United States. But these are families of the United States that are being broken apart by a broken immigration system, and an immigration system that doesn't encounter the factual reality of how our society runs, right? I think that's like not even in question. So in reporting that, thinking through all the reporting that you've done around immigration through the years, like there's something very centralized about the outrage that I think I see, and the tragedy. I think that's one of the lawyers, I think, calls it a sin even. These are moralistic words, but it's hard not to be moved from a human level and from an intellectual level about what went down at this raid and then the consequences thereof. It's not a question, I'm sorry. I'm just like, there's a lot that comes out when I think about it.
I know the story you did that you mentioned, and one of the things that you don't necessarily see in the documentary, because we spoke to a bunch of people that aren't part of it, right? They didn't make the cut, or we didn't put them on camera, but we talked to a lot of people in the community, and something that's very clear is just the trauma that is still super present in these towns in Mississippi.
And I think even if you come at the concept of immigration from the point of view of like, listen, these are people who came here knowingly without papers, like that is a felony if you try to recross after being deported. Like, even if you come at it through that lens, which many people do, the facts of the matter of what happened in Mexico, how it relates to the United States as far as its immigration policies and what we do in our interaction with the Mexican government. I wonder, David and Emily and Chica, if you could quickly go through what happened in that massacre, how is the United States government sort of implicated, as you found, and what was it like to report on it?
Sure. I mean, the court records that we obtained in the massacre paint a very harrowing picture. Just to say from the offset, these officers are charged. They have not been convicted. So I don't want to say they are guilty. But what I will say is that the court records paint a damning picture. They suggest that there were two trucks with the migrants in them, that they were trying to escape what was essentially a convoy of police officers that were chasing them, that were essentially hunting them down, that were firing on them, ultimately firing more than 100 bullets, and then set the migrants on fire and burn them beyond recognition. And that's the picture that the prosecutors portray, and it's terrifying. And they have evidence, they say, to back it up, including eyewitness testimony, including phone records, including residue from the guns themselves showing that they had been shot, and the autopsy reports. So it sort of remains to be seen what exactly the defense will be. The defense says a lot of the forensic evidence was done very quickly and shoddily, and there is a history in Mexico of rushed and shoddy police investigations. So we don't know exactly what the outcome will be, but from the evidence we obtained and what we know so far, it seems like a harrowing, beyond horrible way that they died in the final hours of their lives. And I was going to say, yes, of course, 3 of the 12 officers had received training by the U.S. government. That doesn't paint a pretty picture.
We're at a moment again where, the Secretary of Homeland Security is saying there are more people trying to cross than ever. There's a different administration, obviously, in charge now. However, the tactics don't seem all that different as far as how the border is supposedly being managed or whatnot. So after doing this story and considering where we are right now and what you guys might cover in the future, like, can you zoom out for a second and be like, where are we now?
As we were filming the funeral, I had the priest's microphone in my ear. I was hearing what he was saying. And this isn't in the piece, but we're literally at this funeral for Edgar. And a family comes to the priest. There's a mother and her kids. And she was saying, my kid is going to try to go to the US. Please give them a blessing so that they make it safely. And to me, it's like, this mother knew exactly what happened to Edgar and this group of migrants that were caught in this terrible massacre, right? Yet her child is about to embark on the same journey. And so, if a massacre and Bernie, like if this stuff can't, this kind of tragedy, it doesn't make people stop coming. I don't know what will.
So, but in the big picture, I mean, July had the highest number of migrants crossing the U.S.-Mexico border in 21 years. This doesn't deter anything. Raids don't deter anything. Massacres aren't deterring migrants. I mean, what is deterring? The push and pull factors for folks to try and make it to the United States is so much bigger than the violence and the danger they suffer in the journey to the United States, and even the threats they face once they make it to the United States in terms of deportation.
All right, well, thank you, guys. I know just looking at you, seeing how much work you've done over the years on immigration, the amount of energy and the really insightful journalism that has come out of it, and how this story particularly just stops you in your tracks. So thank you guys for all the work you do and for joining me today.